Introducing our panelists now. Ryan Johnson is the Corporate Vice President of Enterprise for the UK. And Ireland, Tom Callow is the Head of External Affairs at BP Pulse. Graeme Cooper is the Head of Future Markets at National Grid. And Cliff Smith is the Fleet Engineering Manager for Tesco. They're joining us now. Thank you very much, everybody, for being with us. Just a reminder to you in the audience, fire your questions in and we will tackle as many of those as we can in the time that we have. Tom, can I start with you? We so often talk with infrastructure about the negatives, don't we? Maybe that's just when journalists ask the questions, but let's talk about the positives at the start. What has changed in the network over the last year?
Well, hi, Peter, and everyone. I think one of the biggest things that's changed is a shifting focus towards the fastest forms of charging. So some great stats from ZapMap, which is one of the biggest aggregators of information in this space, released, I think, yesterday, was that the number of ultra-fast chargers in the UK is 50% up on the number that we started the year with. So operators, including us, are really focused on this area now of rolling out the fastest forms of infrastructure, very much aligned with the scorecard and aligned with other reports that's coming out as well. So there was a report from the Economist Intelligence Unit that was actually released yesterday morning. And one of the points around the UK readiness was actually that it needs to focus more on getting the fastest forms of charging deployed to give people that confidence. We've also seen utilisation grow massively. So, we've had effectively our utilisation is 100% up on last year. So last year we supplied about 16 gigawatt hours of energy on our public charging network. This year we'll be getting around 30 gigawatt hours, so 30 million kilowatt hours. So it's clear that the demand is increasing, but the supply is also increasing for charging infrastructure.
And when do you think, I mean, obviously no one can write a plan for the end game of this just yet, but at what point do you think the network is going to be large enough, comprehensive enough, and fast enough for there to be, complete mass pickup of consumer electric vehicles?
Yeah. So I think we're seeing that the EV market is clearly growing, virtually exponentially. We're seeing that hockey stick curve now coming up. And the infrastructure market is growing as well. And it's the same with any markets where there's sort of that symbiotic relationship. Both are growing, and eventually both will effectively sort of plateau because the markets will become the overall sort of dominant piece of the puzzle. So they'll plateau slightly. No different to the number of petrol stations in the UK, which peaked at around 35,000 and has now come back down to about 8,500 sites in the UK. So we'll have that plateau once the market becomes effectively saturated with EVs, once we have sort of that mass market of EVs where there's tens of millions out there. The infrastructure landscape won't have to keep growing and growing to keep up. One question is always, do we have enough infrastructure? Enough's a very dangerous word because unless you qualify it, it's a bit meaningless. So one stat I'll just leave with you to dwell on is, if you add up all of the charging infrastructure in the UK in capacity terms, so how much charging could it get done on a daily or an annual basis, you end up with a figure that we estimate is around about 4 billion kilowatt hours. Now, that's totally theoretical. Realistically, given utilisation rates and so on, given the fact that cars move on and off chargers, have charging curves that decrease over time, that might be 50% of that. But we're still dealing with 1 or 2, say, billion kilowatt hours. This year, all public charging operators, including us, if you add us all up and say, what's your total utilisation, I estimate it would be no more than 200 million kilowatt hours. So if there's not enough infrastructure, how is it possible we're only using 200 million, let's say, kilowatt hours out of potentially 2 billion? That's the question I'll leave you with if there's not enough infrastructure.
I presume that's due to downtime and utilisation rates, which we'll get onto. Cliff, I'd like to come to you next. One of the companies that has been putting in lots of charging points in the last year is Tesco, with your big partnership with Volkswagen. Can you tell us a little bit about that partnership and actually what the benefits you think are for your business of having that in the first place?
Yeah, hi, Peter. So two trains of thought here, really. So we are rolling out customer charge points across a great number of Tesco stores now, and obviously for our own operations, we're now starting to introduce EVs into our .com operation. But I think from Tesco's perspective, we see that as pretty much a requirement for our customers moving forward. As an example, I was at a store quite recently, and the charge points we've already installed are very well utilised, and our customers are, I wouldn't say expect that, but I think in the future they will, not just in our supermarkets, but in a great many other public sort of areas where vehicles are used.
Now, I know it's very early days, but have you seen any tangible impact of having those charging points there? Do you get people coming to shop to you from, say, further away, or different types of demographics of shoppers you wouldn't get before? Or or changes in anything that's actually been driven by having those charging points there?
I don't have that detail, unfortunately, Peter, but I'm happy to take that away and sort of look at that and come back as the next step. I don't have that info for today's call.
It's just because it's early days. A lot of supermarkets and general sort of destination shopping places talk about having EVs and how that might change the people that shop there and change shopping habits. It'll be interesting to see how that happens there. We've had a question come in already that we're going to go to. Do you believe we need regulation to limit the kilowatt hour cost as fast chargers, as this for some people is a barrier to entry for those who can't charge at home? Tom, can I come to you on this?
So I think the challenge with this is around scale and utilisation, as you've already alluded to, Peter. So if you think about the rising costs we're seeing in other markets at the moment, the rising costs in wholesale gas prices, rising costs of electricity prices. I mean, I've just renewed my domestic electricity tariff, for example, and it's a lot more expensive than it was last year. Those companies are very large utilities, obviously can hedge, can do all sorts of things where actually you're able to protect yourself slightly against those price rises, whereas most charging operators are in that space where we're still relatively nascent businesses. It's maximum sort of a 10-year-old market. So actually, I think as you see that scale, you'll see much more ability for companies to respond, say, more effectively on pricing and so on. But I would just say, I mean, I think it depends on the business model as well. Pay-as-you-go charging, just like a pay-as-you-go mobile phone, tends to be more expensive per kilowatt hour. I think you'll see a lot more in fleet, see things like subscription models or bundled models, sort of all-inclusive models, like you see with phone data, where you can actually charge sort of effectively more affordably on a kilowatt hour basis. So we did a trial with a major fleet operator in London. They ended up paying, I think it was about 6 pence a mile, and they exclusively rapid charged their vehicles. They didn't do any slow charging; it was all rapid charging, and ended up about sort of 6 pence a mile. So it's not particularly high cost really when you think about the cost of petrol diesel being at least double that, I would suggest.
Exactly. Well, having charged an electric van at one of your forecourts earlier in the summer, it cost about £8 to fill the whole thing up from empty to full, although equally we spent about the same amount on snacks from the petrol station at the same time waiting for it to charge. So Ryan, I want to come to you now. Talk a little bit about Enterprise's involvement in this. Obviously we know you as a giant car rental group, but are you thinking about infrastructure? Are you seeing infrastructure as a barrier to your customers going electric?
Yeah, thank you. I think as an industry as a whole, we all are very excited about the journey, and I think some of the positivity that was just mentioned about the increasing infrastructure and different things that are there is a very positive sign. If you think about rental car, it's a bit of an enabler for people to enter into the space, because I can either decide I want to try an electric vehicle through a rental company. I can test something short term as a corporate company. I want to try a commercial vehicle or whatever that might be. And a lot of customers who come to the rental industry come through unexpected circumstance. Maybe my ICE vehicle breaks down, maybe I'm in an accident with it, and I'm able to try an EV as I do that. So there's a lot of adoption pieces there that we can be very helpful in accelerating. We do also as an industry, and I think not just rental car as an industry, but any fleet, not the provider of fleet, but the end users of fleets, do have some different issues that come around because of the either infrequency of the user or the novice users who come into the space. As Tom was referring to, I think there are some really good options for people who have chosen to be owners, who can be a subscription buyer of power for their vehicle, or who can become a member of different things. But if I'm an infrequent user, sometimes those things become very difficult. So one, making it easier to access public infrastructure becomes really important as we want to increase adoption, certainly through the rental car industry or any industry, but also trying to help access to a private charging infrastructure. If you think about a vehicle that's being shared by multiple users, if you think about a vehicle that's being used for the first time by somebody, typically we're giving you a vehicle that has fuel and that you can then refuel in a relatively easy way. If we don't have the ability to have the right power and the right infrastructure at our locations to charge that vehicle and have it ready for you for your use, which could be an unexpected use, that becomes a concern. Your ability to access public charging becomes a concern. So one of the things as an industry that's clearly important to us is making sure that as much research and as much effort and as much understanding is going into how do people who operate larger groups of vehicles that are going to be provided to users access the charging network and the infrastructure as much as the public.
And do you where do you think we are on that? Do you think obviously more needs to be done, but have you got any ideas on what specifically you think needs to change in order for that to become sort of viable en masse?
Yeah, I think where we are right now is we just believe there needs to be far more attention, far more discussion. I think there's a huge opportunity for public-private partnership here. I think there's all kinds of situations where we're going to enable people to access electric vehicles in our major markets, but also if you think of either rural or deprived markets where we're a huge mobility provider for people, and can we partner to be a charging source, not just for our own vehicles, but for others, because they know that's an access point for mobility and electric mobility. So I think that's an important piece. We think about this as rolling out any new technology. A good example that I heard in another discussion is if you're a end user, you're talking about charging at your home, you're talking about charging at your corporation. Think about it as when broadband came out and I wanted to access the internet, I wanted to access something high speed. There was an infrastructure rollout in place that allowed me to access that. If you think about today, trying to access the power I need to run an infrastructure to power my fleet or to power my vehicle at home, a lot of that just isn't being discussed. And you wouldn't expect somebody to have to pay to dig up a road or to set up that infrastructure to access the internet. But today, because so much has been focused the other way, I think we need to really think about accessing, because there have been great things done to public infrastructure, there have been great things done to the grid, but now it's how do I make sure that we can access that in a private way as much as a public one? Because the two have to work together. It's not private over public, it's how do the two work together.
Great, thank you. Well, you mentioned grid, so I'm going to go over to Graeme at National Grid. Graeme, one of the things we hear is that the grid is constrained, whether it's for local authorities putting in charging points or inner city charging points for London electric taxis or for motorway service areas. Do you think that's unfair? And give us a sense of how the grid is changing to accommodate electric vehicles.
Yeah, Peter, thank you. It's a valid question. So let's just for, a bit of a proof point, right? So energy networks are a socialized cost. We're across everyone's bill. And just going out and just building networks will have an impact on people's bills. And so just doing that willy-nilly is not something we can do. So we're obviously incentivized to only build what is needed when it's needed. So Ofgem do a pretty good job of making sure that they do their best to hold down bills. I guess, like all these things, the energy utilities industry has always responded to a mature market. So the one thing we have to be very cognizant of here is this is a market in its infancy. But what I am encouraged by is the fact that we're having this debate now. I mean, a lot of people, particularly Tom and others, will have heard me belly aching on about having underlying grid capacity in the right place at the right time. I'm an ex-wind farmer, and I felt that energy infrastructure held back the growth of wind, right? And that's kind of why I'm a bit like the fox in the hen house at National Grid, because what I'm trying to do is learn from those disruptive technologies and those disruptive market plays to make sure that grid networks are the enabler of the future we're moving into. But with that in mind, what's really interesting is 4 years ago when I joined the job at National Grid, I spent my first 4 months just asking people like Tom and others in the charging space, what is it they need National Grid to do? But more importantly, what do they need to stay out of? What do the energy industry need to stay away from? And as Tom, I'm sure, will tell you, the charging market is a highly commercial, very, very liquid market, right? It needs no intervention. It needs them to innovate. They continue to innovate. It's about service provision. But all of that is predicated on future-proof grid capacity, right capacity, right place, right time. So when we'd heard lots of the messagings from the charging industry, it was intervention is needed where you need grid capacity, but stay out of everything else. So loud and clear, message was given to government. And what that became really has ultimately become government's Project Rapid and what will follow on from that. So, the predication here is that for people to move wholesale, to get to that early majority, people need confidence. The only way you get confidence is you need consistency and continuity in charging. So to have consistency and continuity in charging, you need consistency and continuity in chargers. But the grid is not the same everywhere. So that's why government acknowledged that there was an element of a market failure. They allocated let's say it started with 500 million, and they agreed actually that it should be more. So it became 950 million to do strategic deployment of future-proof grid capacity along the SRN, the Strategic Road Network. Now, I know it's Project Rapid, and others have said, well, it's not been that rapid yet. But when you're spending 950 million, you need an awful lot of checks and balances in government before you can spend it. So what we believe is very shortly, the delivery body will be announced. I'm guessing that it's probably within weeks, as we're 3 weeks from COP. How the delivery body will spend money, how will that work? And also, when we say future-proof, what are we future-proofing for? Are we future-proofing for 2025, 2030, 2050? And also, are we future-proofing for just cars and vans? But what about trucks, coaches, buses? So at the moment, there are a number of things in play. And it seems like the right people are having a discussion. There's some consultation live at the moment about how the delivery body should work. But ultimately, the grid network industry, we're stood here, ready, plans afoot. But what we need is a customer to respond to. So ultimately, that delivery body will be the customer. So that's from obviously a strategic road network perspective. We do know, I spent the day with Western Power Distribution yesterday. If you want to connect a 7 kilowatt charger anywhere on their network, I think the answer is yes. So they're realizing that not people are just not simply charging at peak times, and therefore there is more capacity than perhaps we would normally have treated, the electricity industry would normally have treated. So there's lots of work at play, but I think Tom's absolutely right. There's an element here of, and from Ryan's perspective as well, it's an element of collaboration. We're bringing 3 industries together here: energy, transport, and digital. And the only way we can make that work is by collaborating greatly.
Great, thank you, Graeme. Usually you talk about trucks. Obviously everything's decarbonising, from home heating to everything else as well. There's going to be huge demands on the grid outside of transport, as well as from the transport system itself. Cliff and Tom, I'd like to come to both of you with this question. Probably Cliff first. Just to, when you're rolling out new sites, looking at new sites to put chargers in, how much of a constraint is something like grid capacity? Are there other things that are the main barrier to it, such as, either cost or installation or planning or anything else? Cliff first, and then I'll come to Tom.
Yeah, I suppose in answer to that question, being part of Tesco, a larger organisation, we do have the benefit of an energy team, property team behind us. So I guess my remit doesn't cover that, but we have teams internally that help support that. But the feedback from those teams is at the moment we're not seeing any major issues. That said, we're in the early stages of deployment, and our plans at the moment only are looking ahead to a couple of years. But I think as we face into larger deployments, then yes, there are constraints, and I guess we're just watching the market, seeing where really the path of least resistance, if you like, to deploying EVs and chargers, and that's our focus point at the moment, Peter.
Great, thank you. Tom, when you've been putting in sites, how difficult is grid capacity, or what are the other barriers that you face?
It's hugely variable. Obviously what Graeme alluded to was a significant code review by Ofgem to actually remove or reduce some of those distributed cost for adding demands to the grid, which will be very helpful if you're connecting to a substation, for example, where others are using it. One challenge is where some of our sites are so power intensive that we're buying our own substations. Those reductions in cost that you saw trumpeted all over the press recently won't benefit those sites because they'll be dedicated assets for us. We won't be able to benefit from those reductions in cost. So it does vary. We've had sites where we've had quotes of £4 or £5 million for grid connection before, which just simply makes it not economically viable. So one of the reasons why you might not have seen infrastructure rollout in certain areas is for that. But I think really it's where you can kind of collaborate and work more smartly. So we're speaking to all the DNOs all the time, and one of the innovations that will be coming quite soon is much better information around where existing headroom is, where existing cabling is, and so on. 33 kVA cables that you can actually then map your infrastructure and plots of land that you're looking at for targeting new infrastructure to those. But I think it's improving is the message I would give, and we certainly don't sense that anyone is standing in the way here. We just need to move sort of regulation others faster. But I think product helps, so innovation helps here. And one point that Ryan mentioned was around rental. Obviously, there are products now on the market that simply weren't there a few years ago. So battery boost chargers, for example, that we're rolling out, where you need a grid connection quite similar to the ones that Cliff is using just for his 7 kilowatt chargers, but actually Ryan could be getting 120 kilowatt charging speeds out of those, and they're removable chargers that you could dot around and move around your facilities. If you move off one plot of land and move down the road, you can move the charger. So there are innovations in product that are also helping along the way.
You talk about mapping the cables. I mean, obviously, your petrol stations are based where all the road network is. Do you ever find when you're looking at putting in a charger that actually you're in the wrong spot? That if you were half a mile down the road, it would be much easier to put in electric chargers. Does that make you, is it the case that petrol stations are going to be the most obvious place where charging points are going to be, or do we need a separate network of high-speed charging?
I think that the word there is dangerous in the sense that there's certainly no one solution. There's no one spot that will be the best spot. We need a mix of technologies. We're a firm believer in that it's not one size fits all. It won't all be on street slow charging. It won't all be ultra fast charging. There'll be a mix of technologies, a mix of sites. Forecourts make a huge amount of sense because they are, as you say, existing high traffic locations. They've got convenience on site. There can be challenges around installation. Usually it's down to space more than anything else, space on the forecourt, space in that demise of the forecourt to put chargers in, but we're managing in a lot of places to do that. But we're also building new sites, so dedicated charging hubs, with say 24 300 kilowatt charging bays and convenience on site that will actually complement that offer. So it's complementary solutions rather than sort of rival solutions. The forecourt strategy certainly paid off. Probably the best source in industry has certainly given us the nod that the forecourt we have in Hammersmith is probably the most used public charging destination anywhere in the UK. So if someone says to me that forecourts aren't a very sensible place, they're quite a good place if it's the most used public charging destination in the UK today.
Perfect, thank you. Ryan, I want to bring you in on this topic.
Yeah, I would just really echo Tom's sentiments there. I think that one of the challenges, a little bit of the variability, there's a little bit of a cost lottery of where we're going to put that power in, and is there a substation need, and what are the costs, and costs are changing. And I don't pretend as an industry to have that answer. That's another reason why I think there needs to be further discussion between government and public resources and private resources to figure this out, because as much as we want to make sure that we leverage the existing grid and we leverage the existing infrastructure, the ultimate goal is to provide mobility solutions for people who need to use mobility where they live and work. And so we've got to find a way to have reliability there. We mentioned before the kind of replicating the petrol station concept. Well, that gets challenging if I'm a less frequent user, because I wouldn't need a membership to go to a certain petrol station where I might to be a charger. And we realize why that's the case today, but enabling us to have those things around is really important. If you think about the number of, just in the rental industry, but there's many industries facing the same thing, the number of locations you're trying to upfit. The initial estimate we had was over 500 million to upfit the rental locations that exist today. That's gone up almost 50% over the last 6 months or so. So is that a viable way to do this, or is there another way to do it? Is there a better way to share? I think the cost variability and the ability to make sure we're leveraging public and private together is a really important piece that he mentioned that I think is certainly facing our industry and many other end user industries.
Great, thank you. I want to come to Cliff very briefly, and then we've got a question from the floor I'm going to put to Graeme. Cliff, are there any infrastructure, when you're looking at decarbonising Tesco's own fleets, are there any infrastructure constraints on that make it more difficult? Or is it more of a question of sort of product availability for you?
I think product availability is probably the key one for us at the moment. If you look at the van fleet, it's only one manufacturer that can give us a 4.25 ton gross vehicle weight chassis cab, whereas manufacturers are primarily focusing on the 3.5 ton panel van. If you look into heavier truck, then you'll see pretty much most major truck manufacturers have either got test vehicles or just starting to open their order books now. So it's availability really. If you wanted to move into some of the heavier sectors, is the showstopper at the moment. Vans, it is starting to, that door's starting to open really.
Great, thank you very much. A very brief question to Graeme, and then we're going to finish with Tom. Graeme, who has re-established his grid connection to us. Graeme, we've got a question that's coming from the floor about electrified road charging, under road charging. Is that a technology you think is ever going to be viable? Is that a headache from a grid perspective of getting that to work?
Yeah, so firstly, Peter, sorry, I've been let down by the underlying network infrastructure of my broadband provider. So I suddenly find myself in the garden on 4G rather than on fibre. So anyway, it shows you the importance of having the right underlying infrastructure to allow stuff to work. So let me pick up can I pick up on one other thing before we come to the answer about in-road charging?
If you can do it in 30 seconds, yes.
Okay, very quickly. By 2050, we will consume twice the amount of electricity in the UK than we have today. That will need 4 times the amount of renewable generation than we have today, and that will mean twice the grid. So don't forget, the grid is growing and changing to accommodate the massive change. Transport is only one small element of that change. When it comes to induction charging, there's probably a great role for that around things like taxi ranks, around where you have vehicles queuing. Do I foresee an answer where it's going to be under the slow lane of the M1? I'm not entirely sure, but don't forget, as the underlying grid infrastructure, we'll provide the grid infrastructure wherever it's needed. If that's the technology that prevails, we'll support it.
Perfect. And Tom, in 30 seconds or less, we talk a little bit about the infrastructure for vans and HGVs. Is that there on your sites? Is it coming?
Absolutely. And one of the reasons, obviously, that infrastructure hasn't necessarily supported that in the past is that if you think about where infrastructure has been deployed, it's been in things like existing car parks, which make it very hard to adjust the infrastructure layouts for things like larger vans and HGVs. As you see big hubs develop, like the ones that we've announced, other operators are already doing them and have announced them as well. So as you see these dedicated locations, they'll give you much more space and much more bespoke infrastructure to cater for those larger vehicles. And the final thought from me is, this industry is moving from an infrastructure industry to an experience industry. So it was a very immature approach, was dumping stuff in the ground as quickly as you can, land grab. We're now moving into that space of being an experience industry, where it's much more focused on the experience both of fleets and also consumers, and making it as easy as possible to charge electric cars and vans and HGVs.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to you for your questions. Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of those, but as ever, this was a popular topic. But Ryan, Tom, Cliff, Graeme, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts there.